Hi, everybody. Welcome to the HR Roundtable. Thank you so much for joining us today for Unlocking Your Human Potential, Redesigning Work with Generative AI. I'm PJ Trudeau. We're so glad that you could join us for such an important session. It's something that I think we're all talking about in so many different ways within our lives, and especially from HR's perspective, AI is absolutely an area that I think a lot of us are focused on with really what's next and what does that mean for us going forward. Generative AI has emerged as a really hot business topic this year, and obviously for good reason. It has offered unparalleled power to consumers and has had the biggest impact on technology since the introduction of the smartphone in the 2000s. Anyone with minimal tech skills can produce content, sound, and images with generative AI. Business leaders and HR professionals want to understand the impact, both positive and negative, that it will have on their organizations. And today we are joined by Dr. Caryn Paul, a behavioral scientist, industrial organizational psychologist, and an HR practitioner who will help us to learn more about generative AI and explore how it can be adopted in organizations. Michelle, let me turn it over to you.
Great. Well, welcome everybody. As PJ mentioned, we're going to cover a hearty amount of content today, and our agenda is made up of 4 parts. First, I will share 4 things that you need to know about generative AI from my humble opinion. And I recognize that each of you have probably come to this webinar with different levels of experience with and knowledge of generative AI. So I'm going to cover what I think is most important to know as HR professionals. Then second, I'm going to share several use cases or examples of ways generative AI is currently being used in the business context and ways that I see responsibly and ethically used. Third, I'm going to share a step-by-step process for exploring how you might redesign jobs, teams, and business processes as a result of this technology. And then I'm really psyched. The last 15 minutes we've reserved for a great Q&A session. We're going to open up the floor for questions, and I've asked PJ to help me moderate that section as well. All right, so as we proceed, one quick thing. Please use the chat box to go ahead and put in any comments or questions you have as we proceed through, and PJ will help me review those, and hopefully we'll cover as many questions as we can. If we can't get to everything, I promise to provide written answers to questions after the webinar. I'm happy to do that because I know this topic, as PJ mentioned, has a lot of interest and a lot of just different questions that we want to make sure we attend to. All right, so let's get started. First, what do you need to know about generative AI? So going from left to right in this section, I'm going to cover basics about the tools themselves. What are they? What can they do? After that, to the right, I'll share some information about trends in automation and the job impact on jobs. What does the introduction of these tools mean for the jobs, and how can automation be embedded in new jobs? Then third, I'm going to describe some skills for the future that have emerged as more important and more valued as a result of these trends. And then last and really most importantly, I'm going to be talking about the risks that are inherent in these tools introduction and the need for governance, and provide some tips and considerations for you as HR professionals in this area. So let's get started with the tools themselves. Artificial intelligence has been one of the most transformative technologies in the 21st century. So it's really leading a paradigm shift in the global job market. It's influencing almost every industry from healthcare and education to finance and marketing. So what is generative AI, right? So it's since early 2023, which is not very long ago, you've probably heard a lot about AI apps such as ChatGPT, which uses a large language model to showcase its ability to learn and converse on its own. A large language model is a neural network that contains billions of parameters and uses deep learning algorithms to mimic human understanding and teach itself. So it can be trained on a massive quantity of data and unlabeled data, which means that a human doesn't need to sort and code and label that data first. And that's a significant advantage over prior technologies. And in my work, supervised training, sometimes called human reinforcement learning, will be placed onto these models, and that will help the model learn in a controlled, closed environment. And that provides the reassurance that every single piece of AI training data has actually been vetted by a human, right? These smaller models also tend to be less expensive, faster to run, and they can function offline if they're downloaded, right? So these changes are why we're starting to hear about this in the popular press, and why consumers of all types are starting to use these tools. You can have confidence as an HR professional if you use it in a closed environment with human intervention, that the model has been trained on your data, right? Not on the unknown quality of data across the internet, which we all know is a little scary, right? Human reinforced AI often appeals to clients like the federal government or any industry sector where it's really critically important to have 100% control over both the response content and the user-generated data. So with this type of model, the range and flexibility of responses is more limited, but there's assurance that nothing can kind of just go out in the internet and then be used by other companies and other systems, right? So this is the way that we're able to use it in our business context. So a little bit more about generative AI. Generative AI actually has intuition, which might sound scary to some of you, but I wanted to share an example with you that I came across during a recent webinar I attended that was offered by the MIT Sloan School of Management. And this can help you understand a little bit about how generative AI, when trained, develops intuition and can make good predictions about results. Okay, so here we have a prompt, right? And then we have 7 word choices that we might guess, right? Which do you think would be the best guess, right? Well, I'll tell you the answer. It's the word "the," because the word "the" is the most common word in the English language, right? Granted, that's kind of a silly guess because we have a little context. So let's go to prompt number 2. The bank was blank. What might we guess here, right? It's much more likely, as you'll see at the bottom, that the bank is open versus the bank is closed. And it's also very, very unlikely that the bank is unicorn, right? So let's add a little more context to number 3. So frustrating, the bank was blank, right? Now, this additional context has changed our guess, right? No longer is open the more probable answer, but now closed is, because it wouldn't be frustrating if the bank were open, right? Only if the bank is closed. And also, you introduce the exclamation point and the tone to the prompt, which gives the computer more information to make this guess, right? All right, so now let's go to the 4th prompt. We've completely switched, right? Our context. My shoes are ruined. So frustrating. The bank was blank, right? Here we've switched, and open and close are no longer even a remote possibility, right? And they don't make your shoes ruined. Muddy does. And we've also switched from the idea in the first 3 sentences that you probably thought we were talking about a financial institution. But now with sentence 4, we realize we're talking about a riverbank, okay? The point here is that a ton of data that these models are trained on, which gives them context, right, allows them to make probabilistic guesses about the next word. Okay, now I know this example is oversimplifying things, but I really wanted to convey it because I want each of you to get the idea of how these tools really develop intuition about the best or optimal results, given the prompts provided, given the context provided, and given the data that they're trained on, okay? Great. So next I wanted to share the results. Each of you, when you registered for this webinar, responded to 2 poll questions. So I wanted to cover the first one. The results of the first one appear on this slide. This is the breakdown of the folks attending today and or looking at this recording later about your personal use of these tools. And we can see the majority use them occasionally. The majority use them never, and the next most largest group is occasional. So this is actually quite expected because these tools are really nascent, and we also don't really know exactly what our organization's preferences are about using them at work. if I had asked this question about whether you're using them personally, I think the answers will be a little bit different. All right, so I've talked a little bit about the tools themselves, gave you an example for you to understand a little more about how they operate. And now I want to share a little bit about the impact of automation on jobs. The pace of automation will not only depend on the technical feasibility, but also on factors such as the cost of developing and deploying automation solutions, the labor market dynamics, the benefits of automation beyond labor substitution, and frankly, regulation and the level of social acceptance. And generative AI is fueling two major ways jobs are being redefined. The first takes advantage of new ways to apply the technology to automate workflows, right? That's all about increasing efficiency, automating, reducing errors, et cetera, right? That's the first purpose of a job redesign that we're seeing. But the second is to create new sources of value for customers and the business. And according to research by the MIT Sloan School again, too many companies really are focused on the first reason, that's automation, kind of efficiency focus, without also focusing on the second reason, creating value for customers in the business. Workers are seen really only as cost savings versus source of new creativity and value. And so as HR professionals, we want to help guide and inspire our organizations and maybe our clients to move more into that second category, okay? And that's going to obviously help to, have ongoing sources of value for the company and for the individuals working. Next, I'd like to share some statistics on the impact of AI and automation on the job market. We see three major categories of impacts: job displacement, job enhancement, and new job creation. In terms of job displacement, about 50% of work activities globally could be automated using the current technologies available today, but less than 5% of occupations consist of activities that can be fully automated, okay? And by 2030, some surveys show that up to 30% of hours worked globally could be automated. And activities, as you might imagine, most susceptible to automation include physical ones in predictable environments, like operating machinery or preparing fast food. And collecting and processing data are also two other categories of activities that increasingly can be done better and faster with machines. The second column here, job enhancement, which is where we as HR professionals are poised to take the most action. Entry-level employees will see the biggest impact. Their work tasks will change. In a recent survey, 87% of executives believe employees are most likely to be augmented than replaced with these tools. And a bit later, when I talk about the skills of the future, I'll highlight how we believe jobs are most likely to be enhanced. So despite the potential job displacement due to automation, new jobs are being created. But what kinds of new jobs are being created? By 2030, we think that between 400 and 800 million people could be displaced by automation. And of that total displaced, 75 to 375 million may need to switch occupational categories, and they may need to learn new skills. So not surprisingly, many new jobs will be in the technology-centric job families. We're talking about new jobs created. And as AI is adopted across different industries, there'll be a need for professionals who can apply AI in these specific contexts, like an AI specialist in healthcare, finance, or marketing. Some examples of new jobs include also AI strategists that determine how AI can be used to achieve business goals, AI ethicists who ensure the ethical use of AI, and AI maintenance technicians that make sure that the systems are functioning correctly. All right, so we've covered the tools themselves, we covered some trends in automation and job impact. Let's talk a little bit about the skills for the future. This global skills gap is real and growing. executives surveyed estimate that 40% of their workforce will need to reskill because of implementing AI and automation. And that can translate to 1.4 billion people in the global workforce, according to the World Bank statistics. Respondents also report that building new skills for existing employees is its top talent issue. I'm sure you all are already aware of that. In the middle column, increased demand, I wanted to touch that workers of the future really are going to be spending more time on activities that machines are less capable of, such as managing people, applying expertise, and communicating with others. And the skills and capabilities in the third column that I wanted a feature of high value are going to also shift towards more advanced social and emotional skills, along with advanced cognitive capabilities, such as logical reasoning and creativity. And in the bottom part of the slide, I really wanted to make the point here too, that employees will care and already are starting to care much more about doing meaningful work. They care about that more than flexibility of their work arrangement or compensation. And with AI primed to take on more manual and repetitive tasks, employees surveyed by IBM report engaging in impactful work is the top factor they care about, beyond compensation, beyond job security. And on top of that, nearly half of employees surveyed believe the work they do is far more important than who they work for or who they work with regularly. So that just puts more of a spotlight on the job design and on team composition design and on business process design, because the work that people are doing is becoming even more important. Well, what's really troubling about this is that executives, when they surveyed, they don't have the same understanding or view as the employees, right? So executives are saying they believe that impactful work was the least important factor, and compensation and flexible work arrangements are at the top. So we have a disconnect that we're seeing, and we as HR professionals have a poised to make an impact and take action around that, which is really exciting if we love gnarly problems. All right, great. So the fourth thing that you need to know about generative AI is really, in my opinion, really important. Let's turn to a discussion of the risks associated with AI and the kinds of governance critical for employers to provide. Generative AI is disruptive, and with any disruptive technology comes debate. For example, the Federal Trade Commission is currently probing the company called OpenAI for possible consumer harm, following issues like AI-generated hallucinations, which I'll get to later, and the publication of misleading data. On the positive side of the coin, the European Union is setting a global precedent with its Artificial Intelligence Act, which is slated to be published at the end of this calendar year. And that's going to set the stage for some international AI regulations. So there's work being done on both sides of the coin. Okay, next, we asked in your registration question, what is the status of your employer's policy on the use of generative AI? And the results are actually, honestly, not too surprising. The large majority of us don't really have a policy, or if the policy exists, we're not aware of it. About a quarter of us are in organizations or work with organizations where the policy is currently under development. And then the remainder, we have a policy that is published and active. One interesting thing I noticed when I dug into this data a little bit more is the small number of you who have a published and active policy. Of those, I think there were 4 people, right? No, there were 6 people. 4 people were from companies between 50 and 100 employees, which I found interesting. One person was from a company of between 500 and 1,000 people. And the other person was from a company between 5,000 and 10,000. So it just shows you a little bit about where, if there is a policy, kind of what organization size, right, might be more probable of having that policy in place. So let's talk a little bit about what kinds of risks can be addressed by governance and how having a published policy could help, right? So it can really help mitigate the risks inherent in these tools. I wanted to make a quick point here, and this may be somewhat controversial, but all technology can be used for good or bad, right? So in the hunter-gatherer time, a rock, right? A rock could be used to hurt another person, or it could be used to crush wheat for food, right? So it's really all in how you use the technology. That's why it's so vital for organizations to use these tools responsibly and ethically. And this should not really be a top-down initiative. Organizations should establish open feedback loops where individuals and teams can provide input on how these tools are being used. And unlike other kinds of technology, like let's say we were implementing Salesforce in our organization, well, that implementation of that technology system, it's going to come with a lot of parameters, a lot of imposed structure, a lot of ways that, frankly, employees won't have a lot of degrees of freedom in figuring out how to use the tool. These tools are very, very different. Without safeguards and without having them operating in closed systems, these tools are in employees' hands, and people and individuals are making micro decisions all day long regarding how to use the tools. And so policy and governments must be informed by the people closest to doing the work. So I'll talk a little bit later when I get to my step-by-step process of how this governance and policy really does need to be an iterative, responsive activity to the reality of how individuals are using these tools or could use these tools. Okay. Wanted to touch here on the second bullet. I did put some information on the slide about this hallucinations. You've probably heard this in the media, and I just wanted to make sure that everybody kind of level set on the understanding of what this is. So generative AI means just that. It generates something new based on a pattern it's observed from the data with which it was provided, right? We saw that in the bank word choice example earlier, right? And the larger the data set, the more likely AI can generate results with confidence. However, when the AI lacks confidence in its data set, that's when you can run into real trouble. And unlike the traditional artificial intelligence earlier, today's AI can't say, I don't know, it's gonna fulfill the request, right? And if the request is out of scope of what its model is or what data it's trained on, it may struggle to force patterns where they don't really exist, right? And so when a generative model lacks that data to provide a confident answer, it might sometimes hallucinate, right, to fill in information as if it were fact, right? And it would fill in these gaps, and it might authoritatively cite incorrect or completely falsified information, right? And so that's something that we all need to be really careful about. The inverse, when the AI has too much irrelevant data, can also introduce bias, which can create an unfair advantage to a particular group of users. So again, I just want to underscore having safeguards, closed systems, being really careful about how you're training these tools, how you're operating these tools, and what types of data you're allowing the tool to access, right? So the third and fourth point on the slide are really important, as I've been mentioning. So I'm spending a lot of time on this. So earlier, about using safeguards, closed systems, about it, being intentional about who and what data are being involved. I want to just share an experience I've had. Earlier in 2023, I helped several multifunctional teams conduct experiments with generative AI tools like ChatGPT. But we were able to do this in a closed environment. And what I mean is that ChatGPT, the tool, could not just grab any data across the internet and use that data, right? We controlled the data that the tool was being trained on. And we kind of trapped, right, this tool inside this closed place. And we started experimenting with either publicly available data or our own data, that were the company's data, my client, and not the customer's data, right? So that's where we started our experiments. And those of you who are in organizations who are experimenting these tools, probably are doing this because this is kind of the best practice at the time. And really that leads me to the final point of the slide. We, in my experience, were and are very intentional about who was involved in training the tools, right? The types of humans involved as well as the type of data, right? And the type of human is something that people don't think about quite as much, but as we all know, humans come with inherent biases, and we need to use that information to adjust how we're approaching a given topic. Well, this is no different, right? And the way that we configured the teams that were working on these experiments was incredibly intentional, right? We had multiple disciplines represented. So we not only had generative AI experts or data scientists, but we also had domain experts in the topics that we were exploring, like healthcare or cybersecurity or energy, right? And then the final point is that we had varying levels of experience represented. So we had some early career folks, and we also had some seasoned experts. Again, it's really important to be intentional about the configuration of the teams that you're using, as well as having these safeguards or closed systems in which you're experimenting with how to use the tool. All right. So that we've covered the 4 basic things that we need to know about generative AI, and I just wanted to touch a little bit on what I see your opportunity, which, because this all may feel kind of daunting or scary, that's okay. But you as an HR professional really do have a neat opportunity right now. As Sarah Hoffman of Fidelity put it, the people who figure out how to use this tool to be better at their jobs and do things differently are that they did before are the ones that are really going to succeed. And so I've put a couple ideas that are actually from Sarah's article, which is great. And it's true. They're kind of ways that you can think about how you apply this to your own work. First, you can improve your productivity and efficiency. So let's say I want to generate a report or create a PowerPoint presentation. Generative AI can help me speed up the process in the sense that I can ask it to develop an outline on a given topic. Let's say I want to do a talk on employee engagement, and it might help me identify a notional outline. And that would be created in seconds. So if you're like me, I don't know if you are, but sometimes when I'm looking at a blank page, I get kind of frozen and I find it hard to generate ideas. I could use these tools to help, again, provide a notional outline, something to get me thinking about what I might cover. And the important thing, though, to remember is that you do need to have a pretty high level of attention to detail, because you need to double check and triple check that the content is accurate. You need to go around and around and kind of think of generative AI as a early career intern, right? That you want to really double check their work. The second thing you can do is get better at brainstorming, which is kind of related to the first point, but you can see the tool as your brainstorming partner. I know that, it helps me get a jumping off point for orienting my brain in a creative direction. It might bring up things that I wouldn't otherwise have thought of to include in my ideas. And then the last one is you can really help ask silly questions without fear or judgment. So if I have a question, I might ask a coworker, could you explain this to me? They would explain it to me. Maybe I partially understood it. Maybe I didn't really understand it at all. I might feel a little worried about asking that question a second time, right? But I can go to the tool and ask the tool. Of course, I have to double check and do some research around it, but it can help me kind of get over that hump of being, kind of worried about asking certain questions. And alleviate some anxiety around that. So just some ideas for you as individuals to think of, if you haven't already, of ways you might experiment with this yourself and some of the things you could use it to benefit your own job. All right, so we've talked about the 4 things you need to know about generative AI, and now I'd like to share a little bit about the use cases that I've observed where AI is being used in the business context. AI's ability to reason, learn, solve complex problems has really led to its integration into various industries. So first is customer service. AI can be used to automate certain parts of the job, freeing up the employees to focus on more complex and creative tasks. So for example, in customer service, these AI chatbots can answer frequently asked questions, guide users through standard procedures, help with troubleshooting, help with some routine inquiries, right? And this does improve efficiency, but it also enhances job satisfaction of the customer service reps because it reduces the monotony of their repetitive tasks and allows them to focus on more complex issues that require human empathy, human judgment, and can be probably more interesting to spend their time on, right? Also, AI can be used in the customer service context to analyze customer feedback and sentiment, helping businesses improve products and services. The second use case I wanted to feature is in healthcare. So AI is being used to automate a whole host of data entry tasks in healthcare, reducing administrative burden on healthcare professionals. For example, AI can transcribe medical notes, it can schedule appointments, it can manage patient records, which allows healthcare professionals to spend more time on direct patient care. AI is also being used to scrape and review diagnostic imaging, where it can help detect anomalies in medical images like X-rays or MRIs, and that can help aid doctors in diagnoses. Another example of AI in the healthcare sector is with HIV.gov, which is managed by the Centers of Disease Control and Prevention. Their AI solution needed to use a specific vocabulary of medical terms that are allowed to be on the HIV.gov site, right? And those medical terms and vocabulary and ways of describing things are constantly changing, right? But they need to be compliant with CDC's phrasing verbatim, right? And so to accomplish this, they started with a pre-trained model with a person, again, a human, reviewing and tagging every piece of training in that data set, and using that human reinforcement learning I talked about earlier, ensured that the user data was kept anonymous and private, which was a huge consideration for the HIV/AIDS community, as you can understand. And they did not expose user data. They made the large language model a brain and not a mouthpiece, right? So there was this way to make sure that you could leverage the understanding of the machine without putting unsighted content out to the public, right? So it's a really exciting application of this tool. And there are other examples we can talk about in the Q&A if you're interested. All right, great. So the last major segment that I wanted to cover was to share a step-by-step process that I've used to help look at how we might redesign jobs, teams, and business processes as a result of these tools. All right, so this is a 7-step process. And I'm going to run through each of these, and I'm happy to answer questions or delve into these a little bit more fully during the Q&A if you like. All right, so the first one, you might imagine, is to publish your policy and governance. And what a lot of organizations are doing is setting up a governance board or committee to kind of be the convener, right, of this. And again, I put the word heterogeneous on the slide on purpose because, again, just like with those teams that are experimenting with these tools, it's really important to be intentional about the composition of your governance board or committee, and also give it the authority to review trends and recommend policy elements to senior leadership for consideration, sponsor ongoing monitoring and evaluation of how AI is being integrated, right? And this needs to be a conversation with both senior leadership in the organization, but also the employee base as well. And so, we want our policy and governance to be written in plain language. We want supporting communication from senior leadership that reinforces an open environment where anyone can raise a consideration or a suggestion, right? And this really needs to be a two-way dialogue. And then the last point I've made already today is that it's really vital to have established and re-examined policy and governance all along to maintain safeguards and the integrity of that closed system that I talked about earlier, right? What's interesting about this is, remember earlier when I talked about the two main purposes of job redesign, one being for like getting automation in there, automating work tasks, improving efficiency, right? The second one looking more at creating value for customers and the business. And so I just wanted to reinforce here that the policy and governance should answer the following question at the bottom of the slide. How does this enable us to identify and create new sources of value and meaning over time, right? So that's what we want policy and governance to be focused on. Step two, after you have your initial policy, you want to conduct an end-to-end audit of your operating models and your business processes. And what I found to be really helpful is providing teams structured tools to accomplish these audits independently so that they have ownership over the content and a vehicle to make suggestions. Obviously, and I'll get to the next step, these audits will be aggregated and reviewed, but the idea is that the data not come from a quote auditor or internal or external, but come from the actual folks in the jobs that are most potentially affected, right? And a methodology called process mining or business process examination, which I'm sure a lot of you use in your roles, those types of methodologies can be used to analyze how work is done and where bottlenecks or other inefficiencies exist. Also, where certain tasks are more likely to be aided by generative AI. And you can rethink and re-engineer how work gets done that way. You can identify tasks that where these tools are applied might free up employee time for, again, higher value tasks, those types of skill and use of those types of skills that we talked about before. I would suggest that you synchronize this audit with other planned organizational changes. So for example, let's say I knew 3 months from now, I'm introducing a new business strategy for a particular market segment. I might synchronize this audit with the audit that I need to do that's accompanying that other organizational change. So look for opportunities to have this synchronized rather than yet another activity. So after you've done your audit, you want to guide folks to perform their job redesign assessments. That can be part of the audit. It can be a step adjacent to the audit, but the idea is having employee supervisor pairs re-examine their work tasks in their position description and any other documentation they have, maybe a performance plan or whatever, depending on the types of tools that you use in the organization. And these are some types of places where generative AI could help on the slide, everything from writing text to interacting with customers or partners. And I mentioned earlier, you want to guide people to view generative AI as a smart intern. So when you're performing your job redesign assessments, you want to make sure to kind of layer what parts of the task might be used by generative AI, and then what other checks and balances you might need to include, just like if you were introducing an intern into your team. You want to, the third bullet, emphasize tasks with low risk profiles. I mentioned earlier, when we do our experiments, we use our own data, we use publicly available data. We don't use customer data right now until we're really confident of how we're able to use it. Similarly, we want to pick those tasks that are internally facing, maybe to start with, right? Versus sensitive work products that are shared with customers. We don't want to put the tools into those quite yet until we've worked out some of the kinks with our own internal products, right? And then as part of the job redesign assessment, you want to add new tasks, you want to enlarge tasks that are now possible given the redistribution of work. And then finally, these employee supervisor pairs will be preparing job redesign proposals as the end of this step. I mentioned aggregating before. So you're going to want to aggregate all these proposals, assessments, and the results of your audit up to maybe at the team level, maybe the operating unit level. It depends on how your organization is configured. And then you want to use that governance board or committee to collectively interpret the results, right? Then you want to decide how you're going to adjust roles, which should include eliminating repetitive tasks that can be managed by the tool, identifying where teams can possibly merge roles to create space for new roles, and then add new tasks like applying or managing AI tools to your team structures where relevant. Okay. You're also going to want to isolate where to offer targeted upskilling in support of individuals' performance of those higher level tasks, right? And so upskilling is, job redesign is really not only about changing job roles and responsibilities, but it's also about creating that environment that's motivating and engaging employees. And so that can involve changes in the way work is organized, the tools and technology. It can also affect what types of upskilling or other developmental opportunities you have. Okay. Then, I think you probably expected this would happen. You're going to want to re-examine your policy and governance. So if you are starting to implement these new job designs, team designs, business processes, you really want to revise and reissue your policy and governance. And that reinforces the organization's receptivity and sensitivity to the inherent risks associated, right? It's also highly emotionally charged when you're involved in modifying jobs, as we know. And so you want to make sure that that policy and governance and that senior leadership communication is really pushed out, and that you maintain those ways of having open feedback with your employee base. Right. The last point here, you may want and probably will want to establish a routine to periodically reassess on some cadence that makes sense for your company and your market. Step 6 is where we go ahead and implement those changes. We really want folks to help transition from fixed work to dynamic work, again, from focusing on efficiency to focusing on creating value. I know that has been talked about in other contexts, but my point here is that generative AI could be used to supercharge that thrust that might already be happening in your company. And really, it just gives people the way, more fuel, right, to anticipate what customers or clients really want or need, and the space to think creatively and develop new approaches to meet those needs, right? Especially customer-facing staff and entry-level staff, people who might be more directly in touch with the customer or with clients. They can move beyond spending time on routine tasks to focus on dialogue with the customer or uncovering maybe what has been unseen problems or other activities, right? So again, this is about helping to maintain and support this environment for your employees. And finally, I love evaluation. I'm kind of a data geek around evaluation. So of course, I'm going to suggest that you conduct some sort of an impact assessment and use that data to refine. That can be fed up to your governance board or your committee, again, which hopefully has mixed representation. And we want to use digital channels to periodically collect input from employees, supervisor pairs. How's it going? What did you work well? And then getting that feedback and feeding that back in to the system, right? And again, this also reinforces the philosophy that the company is looking to give jobs more meaning. It's looking to meet employees where their highest interests lie and possibly create new jobs, maybe even adjust career paths. And all this data can be used to support that evolution. All right, so that's the last of the 7 steps of the process here that I've used, and I really am happy to share that with you today. We're getting close to the Q&A portion of today, but before we open the floor, I just wanted to make a few concluding points. First, that organizations who embrace generative AI and other emerging tools are not just safeguarding their employees' careers for the future, but they're also setting themselves up for success, because these tools are not going anywhere. And they would be enhancing the company's competitiveness in the marketplace. And then something I probably don't need to emphasize with this crowd, but investing in employees' development, job enhancement, that's also boosting morale and job satisfaction. So employees are given the opportunity to learn those new skills, take on new challenges, ask for ideas. they're going to be more engaged and motivated. They're going to be able to be more invested in their career progression, even in a job market that's being transformed by AI. And so we as HR professionals just need to ask ourselves, hey, as technology frees ourselves to do different work, what are the mindsets, tools, and behaviors that we need in order to embrace the value that this shift is bringing to us? And what kinds of investments do our organizations need to make in this? So again, it may be a little scary and maybe a little daunting, but rather than resist this change, the opportunities exist for those companies that embrace this as a trend and find it as a way, an opportunity to improve, to engage with their employees even more deeply, and to deliver better value to their customers. So great, thanks so much for listening, and I love to open the floor for questions. So I'm going to invite PJ to come on the mic here and we can have some fun exploring whatever questions y'all have.
Absolutely. Well, please do either come off of mute or put the questions you might have in the chat. Michelle, thank you. It's so much information. Like you said, I do think for a lot of us, it is extremely daunting. Where do you begin? What do you start with? What do you suggest for organizations, especially those that perhaps are limited budget, or knowing that this is something that we are going to have to address at one point or another, and we're being asked perhaps by leadership to kind of lead the driver, at least get things started on what we should be doing? What's the best way to kind of proceed from that perspective? And especially when you're looking at it from an HR perspective, how do you start that, and what would you suggest we do?
So I would suggest experimentation as kind of a logical response, but finding those pockets of employees who are interested in experimenting with these tools and finding it's really actually becoming a lot more fiscally reasonable to conduct these experiments with tools that, again, you can download offline into your internal employee organizational technology environment, right? And run them internally with small groups and small teams. I think that that's really the best way to start looking at this, because again, we don't really, there's so much that we don't know right now. And if policy and governance comes out as kind of a top down, list of what you can't do, right? Rather than leveraging some at least early learnings from experiments about what possible little things you can do, it really does set the tone in a more, I think, comfortable, maybe not comfortable for everyone, but healthy is what I was meant to say, organizational environment. Because folks, I don't know, people are using these tools personally. Obviously, sometimes our personal experiences do relate to our work experiences. We're whole people, right? So giving people an opportunity to be part of these little mini teams that are experimenting could be a great way to be responsive to some growing interest of certain groups of the organization. And then providing maybe some targeted outreach to folks that might not naturally be early adopters, but folks who you could kind of help to join these groups with, again, reassurance and support systems that help those folks be involved too, because you don't want your experiments to be so skewed with only the folks that are super excited and on the leading edge of these tools. As I mentioned before, you want to have these heterogeneous little small teams. So it's going to require some targeted outreach, and depending on the composition of your employee base, that could look different.
Thank you. Certainly very helpful. I think that we definitely have a lot of concerns from an HR perspective about privacy and other areas that we really want to make sure that we are addressing and looking at. And like you said, there's just so much to do at this point. Where do you begin? We do have a question from Zell. He asked, any recommendations on the best ways for employees to go about upskilling on how to interact and work properly with these AI tools? Aside from experimenting on their own, is there organized training out there that you're aware of?
Yes, there is. And actually, I would love to prepare kind of a wish list, right, of sources and opportunities for that training, and follow up with that after the webinar, because it's changing by the week. I mean, literally, my list of the preferred go-to places 30 days ago looks completely different than it did last week. So don't want to give you all the outdated information. But there are some no-cost, low-cost opportunities for employees to kind of get these like basic primers or even mid-level learning experiences about the tools. And some of them are for a fee, but a lot of them are open and free for folks to engage with. And then there's certification programs for those that are really interested in digging in. Those are hard to get into right now, as you might imagine. There are wait lists for many of them, but I can also recommend some more formal certification bodies that are running programs that I know are of high value and of high quality. Great question. Thank you.
Do you recommend putting out any type of, I know you had said don't put out any kind of policy of what we don't want you doing without taking the time to really understand what we need to do. I know sometimes a lot of we'll get a policy out, kind of put some guidelines around what we're doing. And it does really sound like that for a lot of it, unless you're industry specific or you're specifically using tools for certain things, it doesn't really necessarily make sense to have even that more of a general policy out perhaps just yet. Does that sound right? And if that's the case, are there other tools that we could be looking at? And it'll be great to have those examples that I can share with the group. But are there other things that give us ideas of kind of sample policies or different ways of things that we should, different things that we should be looking at in order to draft those?
So a really common starting place, which I think is healthy, is to go ahead and put a policy out there that says that you can only use these tools on internal data, for example, right? You can't use these tools with any customer data, any client data. If you want, again, as an HR professional, a good example is, and I did this with one of our experimenting teams, we looked back at employee engagement data over the last 3 years, and we mined all of the qualitative data, and we did a comparison between how the machines ran the results versus how the humans had over those last couple of years to see how well the tools would do. Tools did really well, right? So that would be an example of a authorized use of a tool, is to look at your own employee engagement survey data as an example, right? Or maybe there's some data on your quality processes that is already and exists and really does remain internal to the organization. Those are very natural first places to go. And I think that it's perfectly okay to start to have a policy issued that is very broad, and just says, look, we endorse using these tools, starting to experiment with these tools, but only on internal data. And so that's where I see most organizations beginning. And then in certain slices of their workforce, depends on what type of organization it is too, right? If it's manufacturing, they might be looking at one particular area, and they might have a policy that's particularly geared towards that division or operating unit that would look very different from another, right? And so some of it is having policies that are cascaded and are slightly customized for various operating groups. I know that makes people's heads kind of hurt because then you're making 16 policies potentially. But some of these tools, especially if you are going back and ideally you are revising and reissuing your policy, then that might really help the tools begin to get adopted in those areas where, again, it's lower risk and higher benefit at the outset.
Great. Such fantastic information, and certainly gives us a lot to think about as to next steps and what it is that we should be doing within our organizations, which of course, certainly depends upon the organization's culture and certainly what the organization does. But it does seem like that there are a lot of ways AI can even really be implemented into just everyday processes that we're doing, especially from an HR perspective. I know that, and I know it's more specific from HR's perspective, but there are a lot of different AI tools already that a lot of us see in recruiting, resumes that we
Oh,
receive.
yeah.
You can tell when you get an AI generated cover letter, different things that come in to us, and trying to determine what are the best tools for us to utilize. Especially recruiting is actually a great example. How
It
to
is.
determine what makes the most sense from that perspective, and whether or not it will be the best way for us to make those decisions, knowing that we could be dealing with other potential privacy, but also, there have been diversity challenges. So as you said, look at it as an intern, and making sure that what we're doing with it certainly makes sense. Any other closing comments? Again, we really appreciate all of this information, and I will be sharing the slides. I've definitely got that question, as well as the recording with everyone who's registered.
That's great. Yes, happy to share the slides, happy to provide some more answers to questions that we might not have gotten to, or the training question, upskilling question. Certainly will provide those resources to you all. I just think it's a really exciting time. It's a lot to tackle because it's very, again, like I said before, what's so wild about this trend is that this technology is being put right in the hands of individuals who are making these teeny little choices about what to use and how to use it, right? And so if you can support at the team level ongoing dialogue about, and frank and open dialogue about how people are feeling, where they're anxious, what things people have tried that have failed, what things people have tried that have worked. If you can have that open environment that you're supporting, it's going to be a lot more, the teams, individuals, and the organization as a whole, it's going to be a lot more resilient. So I know it seems like a daunting task, but it's actually, on the flip side, it is a great opportunity to sponsor more engagement with your workforce, right? And a way for folks to really dig in and have those jobs that are the most fulfilling for them on a daily basis.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Michelle. Everyone else, thank
Thank
you so
you.
much for joining us. Everyone have a great rest of your day. Thanks so
Thanks
much.
for having me. Have a great one and a great weekend, everyone.